Have you ever paused to think about the moments that define us? Not the grand, planned gestures, but the ones we don't expect, the ones that happen quietly? Moments that ripple far beyond the here and now, changing lives in ways we can't always see. This story is one of those moments.
It wasn't a special occasion, no grand audience or cameras flashing. Barron Trump was just walking, blending into the background like anyone else might on an ordinary day. Then he saw someone others might have ignored, someone the world seemed to have left behind. What happened next wasn't about attention or recognition. It was about a connection, something so rare it left people around him pausing to question their own actions. Before we get into this remarkable story, I want to know where you're watching from today. Drop your location in the
Comments below. We love hearing from people all over the world. And if you're as moved by this story as we were, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that remind us of the power of small actions. Now, let me take you back to the beginning of this unforgettable moment. The man looked up slowly, as if unsure whether the question was even meant for him. His face showed signs of exhaustion, not just physical, but the kind that comes from being ignored for too long. He hesitated for a moment, his voice barely above a whisper, and responded, "I'm just trying to get by." Barron didn't look away or rush the conversation. He stayed, listening carefully. There was no pity in his expression, no judgment, just a quiet patience that made it clear he wasn't in a hurry to leave. People around began to take notice. Some glanced briefly, curious, while others simply walked past, still oblivious to the exchange unfolding. The man began to share more, his words halting at first, but then coming more easily. He talked about how life had taken an unexpected turn, how things he thought he could depend on had fallen apart, leaving him where he was now. There was no dramatic story, no shocking event, just the slow unraveling of circumstances that could happen to anyone. And as he spoke, Barron listened, nodding occasionally, giving the man the space to be heard. This wasn't the kind of conversation anyone expected to see. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't publicized. It was quiet and human. The sort of moment that often goes unnoticed but carries an impact far greater than words can immediately show. And have you ever been in a position where someone truly listened to you, not out of obligation, but because they cared? Imagine what that would feel like when you're at your lowest. That's what this man seemed to be experiencing. A moment of being seen in a world that had overlooked him for far too long. The way Barron approached this wasn't about trying to fix everything or make a grand gesture. It was about doing something small but meaningful. And sometimes, that's all it takes to remind someone that they matter. The exchange didn't end there, but this moment alone left an impression on those who were paying attention. It made people wonder, when was the last time I stopped to notice someone in need? As you think about that, let's continue with what happened next, because Barron's actions took an unexpected turn that no one, not even the man himself, could have predicted. Barron didn't make any grand gestures. He wasn't trying to draw attention to himself. He moved closer to the man and crouched down slightly to meet him at eye level. It was an action so simple yet so rare in a world where people often avoid acknowledging someone else's struggle. His tone was steady, his question straightforward, but it carried a weight that no one around could ignore. "What's your story?" The man hesitated for a moment as if unsure how to respond. He looked up at Barron, studying him, perhaps wondering if the question was genuine or just a polite formality. But Barron didn't rush him. He stayed silent, giving the man the space to decide whether he wanted to answer. Eventually, the man spoke, his voice carrying the kind of weariness that only comes from years of hardship. He started to share bits and pieces of his life, how things had been fine once, normal even. He'd had a job, a small apartment, and friends he could count on. But then things started to fall apart. A layoff turned into missed rent payments, which spiraled into eviction. One bad turn after another, and suddenly, he was here. Sitting on this sidewalk, holding this sign, feeling as though the world had moved on without him. As the man spoke, Barron nodded occasionally, his expression calm but attentive. He wasn't offering solutions or cutting in with advice. He was simply listening, How often do we see that? Someone truly taking the time to hear another person, without judgment or the urge to interrupt. Have you ever had someone really listen to you like that? It's a rare kind of generosity, one that leaves a lasting impression. A small crowd began to notice what was happening. It wasn't the kind of scene that demanded immediate attention, but there was something quietly powerful about it. A few passers-by slowed down, curious but unsure whether they should approach or keep moving. Still, Barron didn't seem to care who was watching, or if anyone was watching at all. His focus remained on the man in front of him. What would you do if you were in that situation? Would you have the courage to stop? Or would you, like so many others, assume someone else would step in? It's a question worth reflecting on, and maybe it's one we don't ask ourselves enough. Barron finally spoke again, his voice low but firm, and asked the man another question. How can I help? It wasn't loaded with assumptions, and it wasn't a pitying offer. It was clear and genuine, and it left the man visibly moved. No one else had asked him that. Not in weeks, maybe months. And in that moment, the entire mood shifted, not with words, but with action. The man's voice grew steadier as he opened up, recounting pieces of a life that once felt normal, even secure. He spoke about his work, a steady job that he had relied on for years. There were memories of a small, warm home where he'd once lived with his family. His words painted a picture of days that, while not extraordinary, were filled with moments he hadn't realized were precious until they were gone. Then came the turn he didn't see coming. It started with a layoff, a sudden loss that threw everything into disarray. Bills piled up, rent went unpaid, and the stability he had worked so hard to build crumbled faster than he could find his footing. His family, unable to endure the mounting strain, eventually drifted apart. One bad day turned into weeks of uncertainty, and before he knew it, the life he knew was gone. He described those months as a blur, each day blending into the next, marked only by a growing sense of isolation. As he spoke, Barron didn't interrupt. He didn't try to steer the conversation or offer quick fixes. He just listened, his posture calm, his expression focused. It wasn't the kind of attention people usually give. There was no impatience, no distraction, just an unspoken message that the man's story mattered. At one point, the man paused, his voice faltering slightly. He admitted, almost hesitantly, that the hardest part wasn't losing the job or even the home. It was feeling as though no one saw him anymore. People don't look at me. It's like I don't exist, he said quietly, glancing down at the ground as if embarrassed by his own words. And that's when Barron spoke again, his tone steady but filled with sincerity. I see you. 3 words, simple, yet they carried more meaning than anything else could have in that moment. It wasn't a grand declaration, but it hit with the weight of something profound. You could see the man take a breath, as if those words gave him permission to believe, if only for a moment, that he wasn't invisible. Think about that for a second. How often do we pass by someone without acknowledging them? How many times do we assume someone else will step in, or worse, convince ourselves that it's not our problem? But Barron didn't fall into those traps. He saw this man, not just his situation but the person behind it. And he made the choice to let him know he mattered. The man's story wasn't over, and neither was this moment. There was more to come, something no one in that small circle of onlookers could have anticipated. What Barron did next wasn't about solving every problem or changing the world. It was about something far simpler, yet far more powerful. Barron reached into his pocket and quietly handed the man a small amount of money. It wasn't an act for show, there was no flourish or declaration. It was simple, direct, and heartfelt. The man took it with a look of genuine gratitude, but what happened next was entirely unexpected. Nearby, a woman who had been walking by stopped in her tracks. She had noticed the interaction, and something about it made her pause. She hesitated for a moment, then approached the man herself. Without saying much, she placed a warm drink next to him, a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes. Another person, this time a young man, saw what was happening and returned with a bag of food. It was as if Barron's quiet act had broken some unspoken barrier, encouraging others to do what they might not have otherwise. Within minutes, what began as a one-on-one moment had drawn the attention of more people. Some offered small gifts, blankets, water bottles, snacks, while others stopped simply to ask the man if he needed help. The air shifted, turning from indifference to compassion. Strangers who might never have interacted found themselves coming together, each contributing in their own way. It wasn't coordinated and it wasn't planned, but it was powerful nonetheless. Now let me ask you this. Have you ever witnessed a moment where one action seemed to change everything around it? What would you have done if you were there? These are the kinds of moments that challenge us to reflect, not just on what we see, but on how we choose to respond. The man, who had been sitting in quiet isolation just moments before, now found himself at the center of a growing circle of kindness. His expression was a mix of amazement and relief, as though he couldn't quite believe what was happening. And Barron? He stayed off to the side, quietly observing, never drawing attention to himself. It's easy to think small actions don't matter. To believe that helping one person in one moment won't change anything. But seeing this scene unfold, it became clear that this wasn't just about one person anymore. It was about a shared understanding that everyone, no matter their circumstances, deserves to be treated with dignity. By the time the small crowd began to disperse, the man had received not just food, money, and supplies, but something far more meaningful. A renewed sense that people cared. And the onlookers who left that day didn't just walk away unchanged. You could see it in their faces. That brief moment had given them something to think about, something to carry forward into their own lives. So let me ask again, what would you do if you saw someone in need? Would you walk past, or would you stop? It's not always easy to know what the right thing to do is, but sometimes all it takes is one small choice to spark something much greater. As the crowd returned to their routines, the man sat quietly, processing what had just happened. For so long, he had felt unseen, as if his existence had become nothing more than a backdrop to the lives of others. But that day was different. That day, someone stopped, not just to acknowledge his presence, but to ask him what he needed, to remind him he was more than the situation he found himself in. In a conversation later shared by those who helped him, the man reflected on the experience. It wasn't about the money or the food, he said. It was about feeling like I was worth stopping for, worth listening to. Those few minutes of connection gave him something he hadn't felt in years, a renewed sense that he could find his way back to better days. With the small amount of help he received that day, and a new sense of determination, he connected with a local shelter, where he found support to start rebuilding his life. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight, but the change was real. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a chance. And Barron? He didn't stay to see how things unfolded. Once others had stepped in to offer their help, he quietly slipped away. There was no speech, no lingering to accept gratitude. He simply left, as if the moment belonged entirely to the man he had stopped to help. What stands out most isn't just Barron's choice to stop. It's the way he did it, with respect, humility, and without seeking any attention for himself. His actions left those who witnessed them with a question to consider. When was the last time you truly noticed someone? Not just saw them, but noticed them as a person, someone who might need just a moment of kindness to feel human again. The man's story is a reminder that even the smallest actions can lead to meaningful change. What began as a quiet moment between two people grew into something far larger, a chance for strangers to connect, to step outside of their routines, and to make a difference. It's proof that kindness doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. What began as a single interaction between Barron and the man didn't just change the course of one afternoon, it changed perspectives. It reminded everyone watching, whether they were there in person or hearing about it later, that sometimes the most impactful things we can do don't require fanfare or massive resources. They just require a moment of genuine connection. This isn't about helping one individual. It's a story about the potential we all have to create moments of care, to pause and choose kindness when it might be easier to look away. It shows that every small step we take toward compassion creates an opening for others to do the same. So, what would you do? Imagine walking past a similar scene tomorrow. Would you stop? Would you ask a question? Or would you, like so many others, move on because it feels too overwhelming, too uncomfortable, or simply because it's easier? There's no right or wrong answer here. but it's a question worth reflecting on. We live in a world where it's easy to become distracted, caught up in our own routines and challenges. But stories like this remind us of what it means to see someone else's humanity, to remind them that they're not alone. Acts like Barron's aren't about solving every problem. They're about showing that someone matters. And sometimes, that's enough to spark something bigger than we ever expected. Think about your own life. Is there someone you've passed by who might have needed a kind word or a helping hand? How might things change if more of us chose to stop, even for a moment? These aren't questions with simple answers, but they're worth asking ourselves, and worth sharing with others. If you've ever experienced or witnessed an act of kindness that stayed with you, share it in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else to take action in their own way. Let's start a conversation about what compassion looks like and how we can bring more of it into the world. And as you think about that,
Dare this. Every small choice we make has the power to resonate far beyond what we can see. You might not know the impact of your kindness today, but it could be the moment someone remembers tomorrow. If this story moved you, let us know by hitting that like button and sharing it with someone who could use a little inspiration. And don't forget to subscribe to hear more stories that remind us of the good we're all capable of doing.